This man, every young girl's dream really, is Herbert Oswaldson Duncan. Now, you may not know how he fits into the Tour de France of Eddy Merckx, of Miguel Indurain and Chris Froome, but he does. You see, Herbert was a British aristocrat who lived in Paris, and before that he did pretty well on a bike. But the one thing he disliked about Paris was that it didn't have a bike track, so he couldn't race. Well, he couldn't ask the folk back home to buy him one because he was the black sheep of the family for having gone to Paris in the first place. And so he got the Folies Bergère to do it instead. Well, they then had to find someone to manage the track, which is how they hit on an opinionated young man called Henri Desgranges. Now, Henri Desgranges, as it happens, held the world's first recognised hour record, and he was still racing well into his 80s. That experience brought him the job of editing a daily sports paper called Loto. And when that didn't sell as well as he'd hoped, one of his assistants took him to this cafe, and together they sat and talked over a publicity stunt so huge that nobody could beat it. They called it the Tour de France. And so, in midsummer 1903, anyone who fancied having a go lined up at a bar on the city's edge and turned his pedals into history. The organisers, the spectators, and even the riders had to make up things as they went. This was all new. If buckets were put out for drinking water, well, who was to say you couldn't wash your feet in them as well? And since nobody had thought of any other way, you stopped every so often to sign a check sheet, and you helped yourself to food that had been left out for you. That first tour, and all the tours for the next 50 years, finished here. Or not precisely here, because the site is now a giant sports stadium, but on a big pink track called the Parc des Princes. Henri Desgranges managed that track as well, and he ruled his race like an emperor. He terrified riders, and he terrified the sport, internationally as well as in France. He was cycling's godfather. But he fell ill just before the Second World War, and his place was taken by the gentlemanly, smiling Jacques Godet. His bust is high in the Pyrenees on the Col du Tourmalet. Godet saw the Tour through its golden era, a time which turns old men religious. Riders like Gino Bartali, with the looks of a pizza chef and a world-class talent for moaning. And Fausto Coppi, a thin-boned, melancholy man who surpassed him. At his peak, they say, you didn't need a stopwatch to time his victories. A church clock would do it just as well. The Tour then went over mountain roads still strewn with stones, too remote, too difficult to be lined with spectators. And sometimes those mountains proved just too hard. It was here on Mont Ventoux in 1967 that Tom Simpson died by the roadside, dry, overheated and drugged. By the 1970s, the Tour was in trouble. Sponsorship was sold in penny lots to anyone who'd buy. Riders were made to race twice a day just to increase the gate money. And so Godet left, and his colleague Félix Lévitan was fired. For a few years the Tour stayed in limbo, until a man who had himself ridden the race determined to make it once more a world spectacle. His name was Jean-Marie Leblanc. His Tour was dominated by a tall and characterless Spaniard. Journalists said the most interesting thing about Miguel Indurain, off his bike, was finding anything interesting to say about him. And when he'd finished, along came a prickly American, Lance Armstrong, winner 7 times in a row. To Americans and to others, it was glorious. But for some, it seemed too good to be true. And it was. He denied it, he went to court, he ruined other people's lives. But the truth, he was drugged. Systematically, heavily drugged. He is one of the sport's living dead now. His name appears nowhere among the winners. His name appears, in fact, only in stories about people who want their money back. Armstrong has gone, Leblanc has retired, and the Tour now is run by a fresh-faced man, almost a boy. Christian Prudhomme is the guardian of the legend. Join me, join him, join the legends in Tour de France Inside Story.